And so, with the Labour Party taking over from the Conservatives, who are busily backpedaling on their environmental commitments after, in my view, the crazy foray into net zero by Theresa May, a short-lived Prime Minister, it's not really clear where Labour want to take us. There seems to nevertheless be a clear plan to achieve net zero, though I'm at something of a loss to understand why. They don't talk about the science. They act as if it's settled. If it is settled, it's settled in favour of CO2, not against it. Joining me now is Harry Wilkinson, Head of Policy at Net Zero Watch, a group known for its critical thinking, let's say, on climate change and net zero targets. Great to have you with us, Harry. We've had about a month and a half of the current government. Are you impressed with their net zero policies? What are they? What are they doing?
Well, I'm not impressed at all, Lembit. Ed Miliband seems to believe the same sort of narrative that we heard repeated by actually Conservative government ministers in the past, which is we can just roll out more and more wind and solar energy and things can only get better. The reliance on wind and solar would mean that we would be, escaping the volatility of fossil fuel markets. That is the line that Ed Miliband is using. That's the line that the government used to use. So we've seen no real change in the fundamental policy direction under Miliband compared to what we had before. However, we have got this rather disturbing policy of great British energy, which seems to be undertaking a pointless foray of nationalisation just to add to the mix of inefficiency that we already have. And he wants to speed up the timeline to decarbonise the electricity grid from 2035, albeit that was an already unrealistic target. He wants to bring that forward to 2030. It's very unclear in my mind how any of that's going to decrease bills. When we look at the government's real numbers, which look at levelised cost of electricity on an enhanced basis, so they take into account those wider grid impacts that you have from wind and solar, they find huge benefits from having reliable power, and therefore the comparison looks much less friendly when you compare wind and solar to gas plants on a levelised basis, albeit there are huge uncertainties, so the government can just wave it away as within a range of uncertainty and not having any firm conclusions from that. But the numbers, to my mind, are quite clear, and that's that there's a huge benefit from having reliable power, both in terms of system inertia that is just inherently required by modern power grids, and also having power when you need it. That's obviously a huge benefit. Most power engineers recognise the importance of that and the economic value of having reliable power that wind and solar simply can't provide. So Ed Miliband doesn't have the answers on these big questions. And when you look at the UK's numbers, we find the most expensive industrial energy costs across Europe, which is the continent which has the highest energy costs as it is. And that's because here in the UK, we've embarked on net zero just like the other European countries, but we impose our subsidies and the burden of the cost of the subsidies relatively more on businesses than they do in other European countries where there are more reliefs in place for industrial users of energy. So what we've seen is a faster pace of deindustrialization here than elsewhere. And Miliband seems happy to let that continue.
It does seem to me, from what you've said and my own research, that the idea of ending the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030, thereby forcing us to either not have a car or have an electric new car, is utterly preposterous. There won't be the infrastructure. And then on top of that, this concept that somehow they'll have a zero carbon dioxide emitting national grid by the same date is just poppycock. It's impossible. And furthermore, I know that you don't tend to go down this path. We're doing it for no reason, because human-generated CO2 can't even be driving climate change in any significant way. But on those first two, leaving aside my inherent rejection of the entire carbon dioxide war, they can't do this by 2030, can they? With 7.9 billion, it would cost like $1 trillion or $2 trillion to do this.
Well, it seems incredibly unlikely. Most analysts do not believe that this target to have phased out petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030 is remotely likely. And what's most troubling about the way the government's going about this is they're following what's known as the zero emissions vehicle mandate. And so that means we have a target that begins at 22% of vehicles that have to be EVs. That's this year. That 22% of all vehicle sales now have to be electric vehicles. And that percentage ramps up every year until 2030. So this policy is one of compulsion. It's one of mandating what we're going to use, regardless of what consumers would prefer to use. And therefore, it's only going to have a cost to consumers. If it was going to be driven by the technology and people were being given a free choice and they were happening to choose EVs, that would be one thing. And I would have little complaints with that. But because this is being made compulsive, it's a policy that can only have huge, huge costs for consumers who are being totally ignored. It's not being given any weight whether consumers actually want these things. And what we've seen on top of that is a huge strategic failure from Europe and the West more broadly to consider the competition implications with China. China has a huge head start with EVs. It's flooding the global market with cheap EVs. It's able to make them much more cheaply than we can or are likely ever to be able to. So we've had these incredibly strong car brands from Europe who have been around for over a century, producing excellent motor vehicles. And that industry is collapsing in a very short timescale because they've naively gone along with governments who have been saying, we'll just move to EVs and we'll be able to produce those like we produced motor cars before. But they've not been able to. They've not been able to grasp how to do this cheaply and affordably. And so we're seeing what's in an awfully tragic situation, which is a beloved and brilliant car industry that produces cars that people love to drive, that's just dying and disintegrating overnight and refusing to produce the cars that its consumers want to buy.
A couple of points from that. One is that last year, I was just looking while you were talking, about 17% of sales were electric vehicles in the UK, but many people feel the market's saturated. In other words, it'll go down now because people who want electric vehicles have bought them and the rest of us don't. And the second point is the strange contradiction where some European countries want to put very high import tariffs on electric vehicles from China, which suggests they care more about their economy than this fake climate crisis. Because if we're really boiling the world, as Antonio Guterres ridiculously says, then we should do anything to reduce our CO2 emissions. So how do you square the fact that they're putting these huge tariffs on imported electric vehicles at the same time as telling us we need to get electric vehicles?
There is a huge contradiction here. And of course, it can't be squared because the policies are in complete contradiction. And we saw that to begin with from the United States, which led this charge with President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which was aimed squarely at China and trying to preserve some American brands against Chinese and other foreign competitors. But that's undoubtedly going to increase the price of electric vehicles in the American market. And what we'll see is actually, a slower pace of EV uptake. So when we hear the rhetoric about it being the end of the world and there being no more urgent crisis, if that really was the case, then you have to question why they're then pursuing policies that will slow the global uptake of electric vehicles. And you don't really hear many people on the mainstream media, unfortunately, in the BBC, Sky News, CNN, whichever, you name it, they're not asking these questions, which is that why are your supposedly climate policies actually slowing the uptake of EVs? And, where are your priorities? Is it protecting your own industries, or is it the climate?
A question I would ask, but we're not going to now, when somebody says, well, what do you say to those who feel that we need to act on the climate crisis as fast as possible? My answer is, I say there isn't one. But let's leave it for now. Thank you very much indeed, Harry Wilkinson, sage, objective,